Ori, I want to thank you, the board, and the leadership of the Future Mobility Israel for inviting me here today. You and I started this dialogue 2 years ago over drinks in Jaffa, if you may recall. And today's discussion around how we can harness the power of mobility innovation to fundamentally transform our communities and address seemingly intractable transportation challenges could not be more timely. As the leader for Deloitte's Global Future Mobility Practice, I'm honored to have this opportunity to share an outsider's perspective on how advances in mobility can contribute to creating a more inclusive, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous society. Part of what I want to do today in the starting point to this is to remind everyone what this is all about. One of the great things in Israel is all the technological development and all the aspirations in terms of business models. But I think we have to go back to basics, and I want to start there. And then I want to take us through an evolution of how we've gotten to where we've gotten and where I think we can go. Your white paper, 8 Steps to Solve Israel's Traffic Congestion Problems, is an important step forward in tackling these challenges in a systematic and holistic way. I congratulate you on what you've done. My aim today, though, is to provide context to your work and hopefully, in a very respectful way, challenge you to go even further. For the past several years, Deloitte's mobility practice has been working closely with the private sector, governments, civic leaders, unions, NGOs, technologists, and universities to shape the future mobility ecosystem and accelerate realizing the promise, the enormous promise that it offers. Simply, more people and goods will be able to move faster, safer, cheaper, and cleaner than today. The rapidly emerging mobility ecosystem enables us to build communities that are more connected and thriving economically, culturally, and socially, where everyone has an opportunity to share in this growth and gain greater access to work, better healthcare and education, and to fundamentally improve the quality of life for their families and themselves. And to punctuate this point, there was a recently released MIT study that just came out a couple of months ago that confirms that where people have diverse, immersive, and ongoing physical interactions with one another enabled by mobility and digital connectivity, they're more economically productive and they grow faster. It's a really, really important study that is proof of what this is all about. As many of you know, a series of converging forces are giving rise to a new mobility ecosystem. The positive aspiration for mobility has its roots in a series of converging forces that are reshaping how people and goods move, specifically clean energy, advances in intelligent materials, ubiquitous connectivity, adoption of new consumption models, the advent of autonomy and digitization. It is the convergence of these forces that's enabling all of the innovation and possibilities that exist, and they profoundly transform and, as a starting point, redefine our relationship with the passenger automobile. The forces, though, and I think this is much more interesting, are catalyzing a much more extensive set of changes across all forms of urban transportation. By harnessing the power of digital technologies, we will be able to create a world of seamless intermodal mobility, where each of us will be able to travel from point A to point B using different modes connected that will be cheaper, more convenient, and safer. The innovators advancing these technologies and services are working with a clean sheet approach to mobility. They are not really trying to incrementalize the system that Henry Ford put in place 110 years ago. There is a certain irony, of course, that Bill Ford was here yesterday talking about all the changes and the transformation that Ford is trying to do to drive towards this. Rather, they're asking us and they're challenging us with a fundamental question, and it's the same question you're asking, which is how can we create a mobility system that offers people the freedom to go where they want, when they want, and how they want, but without the negative externalities of today's system. What we need is a new vision for mobility. And as this new mobility ecosystem begins to take shape, these visionaries, urbanists, technologists, engineers, community leaders, economists, and environmentalists are challenging long-held orthodoxies about how we move today. First, they question the idea that mobility requires owning a car. As more people advance economically, continuing to add to the billion vehicles on the road today seems antithetical to the idea of building more livable and sustainable communities. This is central to your effort. Personally owned cars, as we all know, are used on average an hour a day and consume large portions of a family's household budget. An alternative model is emerging based on mobility consumed through per-trip shared models for ride-hailing, on-demand shuttle, buses, bikes, e-scooters, all integrated with public transit. And if optimally deployed, and I underscore optimally, we can use fewer assets to travel more miles faster. So the question is, how do we make that happen? Second, these innovators and visionaries, they repudiate the idea that it is somehow tolerable to accept 1.25 million people dying every year on our roads, principally due to human error. It isn't. With increasingly smart technologies and the advent of fully autonomous vehicles, we can greatly reduce those tragic losses. Third, they reject the idea that we must power vehicles primarily from engines that rely on fossil fuels. It is simply unsustainable to continue to add to a transportation system that accounts for roughly a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions, and where total emissions are estimated to rise by more than 70% by 2050. Instead, we can migrate towards a zero-emission future built on renewable energy. Cities, though, as you well know here in Tel Aviv, are straining to keep pace. So this new vision comes at a critical time. Today's transportation system is increasingly fragile and struggling to keep pace with the strains of urbanization, rapid population growth, aging and outmoded infrastructure. And these pressures will only grow more acute as the population of our planet grows to 10 billion people, and we're 2/3 of the inhabitants. We're going to double the population of cities from 2000 to 2050, from 3 billion to 6 billion people. We are not going to be able to upgrade aging and antiquated infrastructure or modernize existing transportation systems fast enough to keep up. We cannot continue with business as usual. All of the innovation in mobility, much of it being developed here in Israel, is fantastic. It's creating a new vast array of options on the supply side. They will significantly help to alleviate our urban transportation crisis over time. But in the interim, they may actually be making things worse. Many of these efforts are centered around an individual's journey. So this idea of mobility as a service is great, but it's optimizing each of us individually. And the challenge with that is if each of us optimize our own route, then collectively we actually create an even bigger problem. And so the question is, mobility is a complex, interconnected system of systems. Changes to one component can result in unintended consequences that ripple through the entire network. So paradoxically, these innovations in the near term may actually exacerbate the system-wide challenges of congestion, sustainability, and access. The key risk, then, is that these social shifts, new technologies, and specific policies, all pursued with the best intentions, will be deployed in a way that is isolated and uncoordinated. So our team has spent a lot of time thinking about how can we untie this Gordian knot? How can we bring coordination and unity of purpose to the cacophony of mobility activity in a city? How can we bring about large-scale change faster with greater impact, buying us time to tap into new sources of revenues needed to fund critical investments in a truly transformative transportation system? And we have concluded through the application of big data, cognitive science, and behavioral economics, we can begin to shape, mold, and nudge and influence citizens' transportation choices towards those that are more sustainable, cheaper, and faster, and that create benefits system-wide. We are calling this a mobility operating system. There are a lot of people talking about it. I want to give you our perspective on what this is. A mobility operating system provides visibility, coordination, and control so city officials and the private sector providers can better match transportation supply and demand. They can create a more efficient equilibrium. The MOS is effectively a digital platform that overlays on top of the physical assets. It plays a key role as the city's mobility orchestrators. It enables cities to make explicit the hidden subsidies of today's car-centric system. Changing consumer behavior begins by making individuals fully aware of the true cost and value of their mobility choices. Many of the policies outlined in your white paper are premised on that understanding as well. In your advocacy for increasing the cost of street-side parking or offering tax write-offs for public transportation expenses for employees are very consistent with that idea. And MOS extends that logic system-wide by instituting variable or dynamic pricing for congestion, carbon impact, use of and impact to the infrastructure and other measures. We can nudge different mobility consumption choices. The single most powerful lever to change behavior is through using market-based mechanisms to get citizens to realize the full impact of their actions. Key to this concept, though, is the need to ensure that we are creating a highly interconnected system that is inclusive, accessible, and equitable. So just as we might price for negative impacts, we can create incentives for people to travel via different routes that help achieve a different and more efficient equilibrium and that is cleaner and sustainable and accessible. Equally important, the MOS offers a way for governments to generate new sources of revenues. This is essential for funding large-scale mobility modernization programs and making public transit an even more viable and attractive option. We are working right now with a bias towards action. We are on the ground in a couple of cities, systematically and jointly figuring out how to take some of the foundational modules of this MOS. The focus of our work with the World Economic Forum, which we talked a little bit about yesterday at EcoMotion, is on providing an update on best practices globally. And in the next few months, we'll have a lot more specific and concrete ideas to share with you to help you accelerate your progress and impact. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to remake for the better one of the most fundamental building blocks of modern life. To realize the enormous promise and social good that a new system of mobility can create requires to approach this like you are at Future Mobility Israel, in radically new ways with unprecedented levels of collaboration among citizens, communities, civic leaders, governments, and business. So I congratulate you on the very meaningful and concrete steps that you are starting to take to tackle Israel's thorny and intractable challenges. But I also want to challenge you. Israel is a unique, extraordinary global hub for mobility innovation. Your cities, particularly Tel Aviv, face transportation challenges that are very similar to many other global urban centers. You have a unique opportunity to marry these two dynamics, demonstrating how the mobility technologies and services can be harnessed for the greater good of humankind. You can establish Tel Aviv and Israel as the global showcase for how the most advanced, innovative mobility urban center could operate. So I encourage you to continue expanding your horizons and pushing forward where citizens, business, workers, and communities can all share in the benefits that mobility innovation offers. And I also commit to you on behalf of my colleagues globally at Deloitte that we're committed to playing our part in this journey with you as well. Thank you.